In 1888, a Michigan farmer named Reuben Smith stood in front of a white pine stump that was 8 feet across. The tree had been cut 3 years earlier by a logging crew that moved on the same afternoon. The stump had been sitting in his field ever since, refusing to die, sending up new green shoots every single spring like it didn't know the rest of the tree was gone. Reuben had tried burning it. He poured kerosene around the base and let it smolder for 3 days. All he got was a blackened stump that was slightly smaller and twice as ugly. He tried digging around it with a spade and a mattock, and after 2 full days of labor he had exposed maybe a third of the root system, which fanned out in every direction like the fingers of a buried hand, some of them as thick as a man's thigh and running 10, 12, 15 feet from the trunk. He hitched 3 horses to it with a logging chain. The horses strained until their hooves cut trenches in the dirt. The stump did not move a single inch. Then a man pulled into Reuben's farmyard with a strange-looking iron tripod bolted to the bed of a freight wagon. The man was a traveling salesman, and the machine he was selling was called a Hawkeye stump puller. It looked like something between a derrick and a torture device. 3 iron legs, a vertical capstan drum at the center, a long wooden sweep arm extending out about 14 feet, and a heavy steel cable running from the drum down to the ground. The salesman hooked a chain around the base of the stump, connected the cable, hitched a single horse to the end of the sweep arm, and told Reuben to stand back. The horse started walking in a circle. The cable tightened, the capstan drum turned, and with every rotation of that horse, the cable wound tighter and tighter, multiplying the animal's pull by a factor of 25. You could hear the roots snapping underground, like gunshots. The earth buckled and cracked around the base of the stump. Dirt fell away in sheets, and in 19 minutes, the stump came out of the ground. Roots and all, the hole it left behind was big enough to bury a piano in. Reuben Smith bought the machine on the spot. He paid somewhere between $50 and $100 for it, which in 1888 was roughly a month and a half of a laborer's wages. And that single purchase changed the trajectory of his farm because until the stumps came out, the land was useless. You could not plow it. You could not plant it. You could not do a thing with it except look at it and curse. Between 1,885 and 1,920. Machines like that, Hawkeye ripped over 100 million stumps out of American soil and turned 60 million acres of cutover forest into farmland. Almost every farm in the upper Midwest today is sitting on land that one of these machines cleared, and almost nobody alive remembers they existed. This is the story of how America pulled 30-ton stumps before bulldozers were invented. To understand why the stump puller mattered, you have to understand what the lumber industry left behind. Because the loggers did not leave clean land. They left a nightmare. By 1880, the white pine forests of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota had been the engine of American construction for 40 years. The trees were enormous. Old-growth white pines regularly stood 150 feet tall, with trunks 4 to 6 feet in diameter. A single tree could produce enough lumber to frame 2 houses, and the lumber companies cut them as fast as they could get men and saws into the woods. They cut millions of acres. They built entire cities out of that timber. Chicago, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, all of them rose on the bones of upper Midwest white pine. But when the loggers moved on, what they left behind was something people started calling the cutover. Imagine standing in what used to be a forest and seeing nothing but stumps in every direction, horizon to horizon. Stumps and slash. Slash being the branches, the bark, the treetops, all the parts the loggers didn't want, left in tangled heaps across the ground. The stumps themselves were massive. A white pine stump from a mature tree could be 5, 6, 7, 8 feet across. The root system underneath it could weigh anywhere from 5 to 30 tons, depending on the size of the tree and the type of soil. And those roots went deep. Some of them ran 6 feet straight down before branching out laterally in every direction. Here is the part that made it worse. Pine stumps do not rot quickly. A hardwood stump, an oak, or a maple will decay in 5 to 10 years. The fungi and the moisture get into the wood and break it down. But pine stumps are saturated with resin. That resin acts like a preservative. A white pine stump in Michigan or Wisconsin soil could sit in the ground for 30, 40, even 50 years and still be solid enough to dull an axe. There are photographs from the 1930s showing stumps that were cut in the 1870s, still standing in fields, still solid, still sending up shoots. The farmers called them stump prairies. The Library of Congress has images of these fields near Nelma, Wisconsin, labeled the Cemetery of the Forest. Row after row after row of pale, weathered stumps standing like headstones, the ground between them too cluttered with roots to plow. And this was the land that was being sold to settlers. The lumber companies had stripped the timber and then turned around and sold the cleared land to immigrants and young families, mostly Scandinavians, Germans, Poles, people looking for cheap farmland. The railroads promoted it, the state of Wisconsin promoted it, everybody promised these settlers that the cutover would be the next great agricultural frontier. Buy 80 acres for a few $100s, clear the stumps, start farming. Nobody mentioned that clearing the stumps might cost more than the land itself. If you could have stood in one of those cutover fields in, say, 1895, here is what you would have experienced. The smell. First, the air reeked of pine resin and rotting slash. Underneath that, the sharp, sour tang of disturbed soil and stagnant water pooling in the ruts left by the logging sleds. The ground was not flat. It was a minefield of ankle-breaking obstacles. Root knobs, buried branches, half-rotted slash piles hidden under a thin layer of regrowth. Walking across a cutover field was an exercise in constant attention to where your feet were going, and the stumps themselves had a presence. A stump 8 feet across is not a small object. It stands maybe 2 to 4 feet above the ground, depending on where the sawyers made their cut. The bark is gone, peeled away by frost and insects. The heartwood is pale, almost white in some species, streaked with amber where the resin has pooled. The top surface is rough, showing the tooth marks of the crosscut saw that felled the tree. And around the base, the earth is buckled and cracked by the root system underneath, the soil pushed up in ridges like the ground is trying to contain something too large for it. Standing next to one of these stumps, you understood immediately why a team of horses could not simply yank it out. The thing was not just sitting on the ground. It was woven into the ground, interlocked with it, fused to it by 30 or 40 or 50 years of root growth that had hardened into something closer to rock than wood. The methods available before the stump puller were brutal and mostly useless. You could dig. A man with a mattock and a spade could spend 2 to 5 days excavating a single large stump, chopping through roots by hand, prying the wood loose with iron bars. One farmer in Polk County, Wisconsin, reported spending 11 days on a single white pine stump that was 7 feet across. 11 days for one stump, and his 80-acre parcel had over 300 stumps on it. You could burn. Farmers would pile, brush, and slash around the base of a stump and set it on fire. The problem was that the fires often got away from them. Northern Wisconsin and Michigan experienced catastrophic wildfires throughout the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, partly because there was so much logging slash on the ground that any fire could spread for miles in minutes. The Peshtigo Fire of 1871 killed somewhere between 1,200 and 2,500 people in Wisconsin, making it the deadliest wildfire in American history. Many of those dead were settlers trying to clear cutover land. You could blast. Dynamite became commercially available in the 1870s, and stump blasting became common by the 1890s. DuPont actually published instructional pamphlets teaching farmers how to bore holes under stumps and pack them with explosives. It worked, but it was expensive, it was dangerous, and it left a crater instead of a clean hole. One Wisconsin farmer wrote that he spent as much on dynamite to clear his stumps as he originally paid for the farm. And the blasting killed people. A farmer named Herman Kuhnhausen in Hood River, Oregon, lost an eye blowing stumps. Accounts from the upper Midwest describe men losing hands, arms, and lives to premature detonations and miscalculated charges. You could try horses, teams of 2, 4, even 6 horses hitched to a chain wrapped around a stump, but the physics worked against you. A draft horse can pull about 1,500 pounds of sustained force. Even 6 horses pulling together only generate about 9,000 pounds. A stump with a root system weighing 15 or 20 tons, anchored by lateral roots running 10 feet in every direction, might require 40,000 or 50,000 pounds of upward force to break free. The horses could not do it. They would strain, their hooves would slip, the chain would pop, and the stump would sit there, unmoved, as if nothing had happened. So when the stump puller arrived, It was not just a convenience. It was the difference between land you could farm and land you could not. The mechanical stump puller was not one man's invention. It evolved across dozens of patents filed between the 1850s and the 1890s by blacksmiths, farmers, and small-town machinists who were all trying to solve the same problem. The earliest designs were crude. Wooden frames, hand-cranked capstans, rope instead of cable. They worked on small stumps, the kind you could also dig out by hand, so they offered limited advantage. One of the earliest patents was filed by William and Daniel Kimmel in the 1850s. Their design used a capstan mounted on a wooden frame with a lever and a shiftable roller that allowed the operator to adjust the speed and power ratio. It was clever. It worked on paper and in small demonstrations. But it was built from wood and rope, and when you put it up against a stump that weighed 10 tons, the frame cracked, the rope frayed, and the whole apparatus collapsed like a broken chair. The problem was not the principle. The principle was sound. The problem was materials. You could not fight a 30-ton stump with a machine made of wood. The real breakthrough came when iron foundries started building dedicated stump-pulling machines with steel cable, geared capstans, and heavy iron frames that could handle the enormous forces involved. This happened in the 1880s and 1890s, not coincidentally during the same period when American steel production was exploding and the price of cast iron was dropping. Suddenly, you could build a machine frame out of iron for a cost that a farmer or a small manufacturer could afford, and that changed everything. The principle behind every stump puller was the same. It was the capstan. A capstan is a vertical drum, and when you wrap a cable around it and turn it, the friction between the cable and the drum multiplies the force you apply to the handle. The mechanical advantage depends on the ratio between the radius of the capstan drum and the length of the sweep arm. If you have a drum that is 6 inches across and a sweep arm that is 12 feet long, you have a mechanical advantage of roughly 24-1. That means a horse walking at 2 miles per hour and pulling with 1,500 pounds of sustained force at the end of that sweep arm is generating the equivalent of 36,000 pounds of pull at the cable. Add in additional gearing inside the capstan head, which some of the better machines included, and you could reach 50,000 pounds or more of lifting force from a single horse walking in a circle. Think about that for a second. One horse walking in a lazy circle, generating 25 tons of upward pull. That is the genius of simple mechanics applied to an impossible problem. The machines that emerged from this principle were beautiful in their brutality. They had names that sounded like they came from a catalog of war equipment. The Hercules, built by the Hercules Manufacturing Company in Centerville, Iowa. The machine weighed about 800 pounds and came in 6 different sizes. The Hercules could be dragged from stump to stump on wooden skids by the same horse that powered it. The company sold cable, chain fittings, pulleys, coupling hooks, and root plows as accessories. They manufactured almost every component in-house. The only part they purchased from an outside supplier was the wire cable itself. There was the Monarch, the Handy, the Quincy. There was the Smith stump puller, associated with A.J. Smith, who built and refined machines throughout the 1890s. And there was the machine that gave this whole industry its most famous name, the Hawkeye, built in Iowa and sold across the upper Midwest through a network of traveling salesmen who would pull into a farmer's yard, set up the machine, pull one stump as a demonstration, and close the deal before sundown. A Hawkeye stump puller cost between $50 and $110 in 1900, depending on the model and the accessories. That is roughly $1,500 to $3,000 in today's money. For a settler on cutover land, that was a significant investment. But the math worked in the machine's favor. A man with a mattock might clear one stump every 3 to 5 days. A man with a Hawkeye and one horse could pull 15 to 20 stumps in a single day. If you had 300 stumps on your 80 acres, the machine could clear your land in 2 to 3 weeks instead of 2 to 3 years. And that is exactly what happened across millions of acres. The way you operated one of these machines tells you everything about the kind of work it demanded. You started by dragging the puller to the stump on its wooden skids using the horse. The machine weighed anywhere from 500 to 1,200 pounds depending on the manufacturer and model. You positioned the tripod or A-frame legs around the stump, or sometimes 20 or 30 feet away if you were using a longer cable run. You anchored the base by driving iron stakes through the legs into the ground, or by chaining the frame to an adjacent stump or a deadman, which was a buried log used as an anchor point. Then, you wrapped the chain around the stump. This was the critical step. If you wrapped it too high, the chain would slip off as the stump tilted. If you wrapped it too low, you were fighting the full width of the root system without any leverage. The experienced operators knew to dig a shallow trench around the base of the stump, maybe 8 to 12 inches deep, and set the chain down in that trench so it gripped the stump just below ground level, right at the point where the major lateral roots branched out. You connected the chain to the cable, ran the cable up and over the top of the tripod frame and down to the capstan drum. You hitched the horse to the sweep arm, and then you started walking the horse in a circle. The first few rotations were slow. The cable would take up the slack. You could hear the steel creaking as it came under tension. Then the load would transfer to the stump, and things got loud. The roots started to break, not all at once, but one at a time, in sequence, each one sounding like a rifle shot muffled by 6 feet of earth. The ground around the stump would crack and heave. Dirt would cascade into the growing gap between the stump and the ground. The horse kept walking. The capstan kept turning. And with each full revolution, the stump rose another inch. The whole process might take 15 minutes for a small stump, 3 feet across with shallow roots. It might take an hour for a monster, 8 feet wide with roots running deep into clay. But the machine did not care about the size. It just kept multiplying force, patient and relentless, turn after turn, until the roots surrendered and the stump came free, with a sound like the earth exhaling. When a big one came out, you felt it in your chest. The ground shuddered. The air filled with the smell of wet earth and torn pine root, a smell that is sharp and sweet and ancient, all at the same time. The root ball would rise out of the hole, trailing dirt and stones, the lateral roots dangling like the legs of some enormous spider pulled from its burrow. If the soil was clay, the roots came up clean, pale, and smooth. If the soil was sandy, they came up coated in grit, the fine grains streaming off in curtains as the stump swung free. And then there was the hole. A crater 5, 6, 7 feet across and 4 feet deep, raw earth exposed to sunlight for the first time in centuries. You could see the strata of the soil, the dark topsoil, giving way to pale subsoil, giving way to the gray clay or the orange sand underneath. You could see the tunnels where the roots had been, hollow channels running through the earth like the veins of some underground anatomy that was now suddenly and violently exposed. The operator would unhook the chain, lower the cable, drag the machine on its skids to the next stump, and do it all again, 20 times a day, every day, for weeks. The men who made a living operating these machines were a particular breed. Many of them were not farmers themselves. They were itinerant operators who owned a stump puller and a good horse and traveled from farm to farm, clearing land for a fee. In northern Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, a stump puller operator might charge 50 cents to $1 per stump in the 1890s and early 1900s. That is roughly $15 to $30 in today's money. A good operator with a reliable machine could clear 20 stumps a day, which meant he was earning the equivalent of $300 to $600 a day in modern terms. That was exceptional money for the era, and it reflected both the skill required and the danger involved. Because these machines could kill you. The primary danger was the cable. A steel cable under tens of thousands of pounds of tension stores an enormous amount of energy. If the cable snapped, and cables did snap, it did not just fall to the ground. It whipped. A quarter-inch steel cable under load can snap with the speed and force of a bullet. Men standing anywhere near the cable's arc when it let go were cut in half, or close to it. Farm journals from the 1890s and early 1900s carry reports of operators who lost limbs, lost eyes, lost their lives to cable failures. The cable could also jump off the capstan drum if it was not properly seated, releasing all that stored energy in an instant. One account from Barron County, Wisconsin, describes a cable that slipped its drum and whipped across a field, killing a horse and breaking both legs of the man standing behind it. The sweep arm was the second danger. A horse, startled by the noise of cracking roots, could bolt forward, accelerating the sweep arm from a walking pace to a gallop in seconds. Anyone standing in the path of that arm would be struck by a 12-foot timber moving with the momentum of a panicked horse behind it. Broken ribs were common, broken skulls were not unheard of. Some operators built fences or barriers around the sweep circle to keep bystanders, especially children, away from the machine during operation. The third danger was the stump itself. When a large stump finally broke free from the ground, it could lurch upward suddenly and unpredictably. Root balls weighing 5, 10, 15 tons rising out of the earth did not come up gently. They rotated, they shifted, they threw chunks of soil and rock in every direction. Men working close to the stump to reposition chains were sometimes caught under the rising root ball. The stump would come up, tilt sideways, and pin the operator against the ground or the frame of the machine. And yet they kept doing it. Day after day, stump after stump, because the alternative was worse. The alternative was land you could not use, crops you could not plant, a family you could not feed. The farmers who bought these machines or hired operators to clear their land were overwhelmingly immigrants and first-generation Americans. The Wisconsin cutover attracted Finns, Swedes, Norwegians, Germans, Poles, Bohemians. They came because the land was cheap, sometimes as little as $5 to $10 an acre, and because the railroad companies and land speculators promised them a future. One speculator named Caleb Cushing bought 43,000 acres in Polk County, Wisconsin in 1869, and set up an office in New York City where he sold 80-acre farms to immigrants for $1,000 each. The Wisconsin Central Railroad had over 838,000 acres of cutover land it was trying to unload. What the advertisements did not mention was the work. These families arrived on their land and found a field of stumps. Some of the farms had 300, 400, 500 stumps on 80 acres. The timber had been cut, the logs hauled away, and the land sold as if it were ready for a plow. It was not. Before a single seed could go in the ground, every one of those stumps had to come out. And pulling the stump was only half the job. Once a stump was out of the ground, you still had to get rid of it. A root ball weighing 5 or 10 tons could not just be left sitting in the field. Farmers dragged them to the edges of their property using horses and chains, piling them along fence lines in massive, tangled berms of root and soil that became landmarks in their own right. Some of those stump fences, as they were called, can still be found in rural Wisconsin and Michigan. They look like the remains of a war fought between men and trees. Other farmers burned the pulled stumps in enormous bonfires that could be seen for miles, the resin-soaked pine burning hot and fast, sending columns of smoke into the sky that looked like the land itself was on fire. In dry years, these stump fires were just as dangerous as the original slash fires. The heat was intense enough to sterilize the soil underneath, leaving bare patches that took years to recover. Then there was the hole. Every pulled stump left a crater that had to be filled, leveled, and packed before you could plow over it. Farmers hauled dirt from other parts of their property, or simply pushed the excavated soil back into the hole with shovels and horses, tamping it down and hoping it would settle enough to hold a furrow by spring. The families that could afford a stump puller, or could afford to hire one, had a fighting chance. They could clear 5, 10, 15 acres in a season. Within a few years, they might have enough open ground to support a dairy herd or a potato crop. But many families could not afford the machine. One farmer in the cutover region reportedly spent as much on dynamite to blast his stumps as he had paid for the entire farm. Others spent years digging stumps by hand, one at a time, burning slash, hauling roots, making progress measured in individual stumps per week rather than acres per season. The stump puller cooperatives emerged as a solution. Groups of 5 or 10 neighboring farmers would pool their money to buy a single machine and share it among themselves, moving it from farm to farm on a rotating schedule. These cooperatives were common in northern Wisconsin and the upper peninsula of Michigan. The machine might spend a week on one farm, then be dragged on its skids 3 miles down a rutted road to the next. The cooperatives kept careful records. Each family's turn was tracked. Disputes over scheduling, over maintenance costs, over who was responsible when a cable broke, were settled at community meetings held in schoolhouses and churches. There was something deeply communal about the whole enterprise. A stump puller showing up at your farm was an event. Neighbors would come to help, or just to watch. Children would stand at the edge of the sweep circle, eyes wide, watching the iron machine tear stumps out of the ground that their fathers had been fighting by hand for years. The older men would stand with their arms crossed, studying the technique of the operator, measuring whether they could do it themselves, and the women would bring food. It was not unlike a barn raising, except that instead of building something, they were dismantling the last remnants of the forest that had once stood where they wanted their farms to be. Some of these cooperatives lasted for decades. Machines were passed down within the group, repaired, rebuilt, cables replaced, sweep arms swapped out when the old ones cracked. A single Hercules or Hawkeye might clear hundreds of acres across half a dozen farms over the course of 20 years, handled by dozens of different operators, powered by a succession of horses that grew old and were replaced. The machine outlasted the horses. It outlasted some of the farmers. It just kept doing what it was built to do. The numbers these machines produced, when you step back and look at the aggregate, are staggering. Between 1,885 and 1,920, an estimated 100 million stumps were pulled from American soil. 60 million acres of cutover forest were converted to farmland. That is an area roughly the size of the state of Oregon. American farmland nearly doubled in those 35 years, and the stump puller was one of the primary tools that made it possible. Think about what that means. Every bushel of wheat, every gallon of milk, every pound of cheese that came off a former cutover farm in Wisconsin, Michigan, or Minnesota started with someone hooking a chain to a stump and walking a horse in a circle until the earth let go. The entire agricultural identity of the upper Midwest, the dairy farms, the potato fields, the hay meadows, all of it was built on land that machines like the Hercules and the Hawkeye tore open. But the stump puller did not just clear land. It transformed the character of the people who used it. Clearing stumps was the hardest work most of these farmers would ever do. Harder than plowing, harder than haying, harder than anything the land would demand of them afterward. A man who had spent 3 seasons pulling stumps from his 80 acres had earned that ground in a way that is almost impossible to comprehend today. He had fought the earth for it, stump by stump, root by root, and the earth had fought back. The women worked the machines too. There are accounts from northern Wisconsin of farm wives operating the stump puller while their husbands were away at logging camps earning winter wages. A woman walking the horse in circles, repositioning the chains, dragging the cable to the next stump, doing the work alone because there was no one else to do it. These are not stories you find in textbooks. These are stories you find in county historical society archives, in letters written to relatives back in Scandinavia, in the margins of farm account books, where the day's work was recorded in a single line. Pulled 12 stumps. Horse lame. Raining. 17. The cooperatives and the itinerant operators and the individual farmers kept at it for 35 years. And then, almost overnight, the stump puller became obsolete. In 1923, the Caterpillar Tractor Company introduced crawler tractors that could be fitted with blades and pushing frames. By the mid-1920s, these machines could knock a stump out of the ground in minutes simply by driving into it. There were no cables, no capstans, no horse walking in circles, just diesel power and brute force. The tractor pushed the stump over, pushed the root ball out of the hole, and moved on to the next one. A machine that had once required a full day of careful setup, chain placement, and patient horse walking could now be done in the time it took to drive a tractor across a field. The transition was remarkably swift. Within 5 years of the first Caterpillar tractors arriving in the upper Midwest, the stump puller industry was effectively dead. It was not a gradual decline. It was an extinction event. The same farmers who had spent years carefully wrapping chains around stumps and walking horses in circles took one look at a crawler tractor shoving a stump out of the ground with its blade and understood immediately that the old way was over. The capstan principle, that beautiful equation of sweep arm length and drum diameter and mechanical advantage, was suddenly irrelevant. You did not need a 25-to-1 ratio when you had a diesel engine producing 100 horsepower. There is something both triumphant and melancholy about that moment. The stump puller had done its job. It had cleared 60 million acres. It had turned a wasteland of stumps into the breadbasket of the upper Midwest. And then, having accomplished what it was built to do, it was simply set aside. Not celebrated. Not commemorated. Just replaced by something faster. By 1930, the stump puller was functionally extinct. The Hercules Manufacturing Company in Centerville, Iowa, stopped producing them. The Hawkeye disappeared from farm catalogs. The traveling salesmen who had pulled into farmyards with iron tripods on the backs of their wagons moved on to selling tractors, or fence wire, or cream separators. The machines themselves were simply left where they stood. An iron tripod weighing 800 pounds was not worth the effort of hauling to a scrap dealer. So the farmers left them in the fields, or dragged them to the edges of their property, or pushed them into fence rows where the grass and the brush could grow up around them. If you drive through rural Wisconsin or the Upper Peninsula of Michigan today, You can still find them, not many, but some. They are usually in farm museums, county historical societies, or sitting in the weeds behind a barn where nobody has farmed in decades. There is one outside the Western Antique Aeroplane and Automobile Museum in Hood River, Oregon. There is one in the Centerville, Iowa Museum, the same town where the Hercules was manufactured. I saw one at a county fair in Wisconsin a few years ago, sitting on a flatbed trailer, the iron legs streaked with orange rust, the capstan drum frozen solid, the sweep arm long since rotted away. A hand-lettered sign taped to the frame said, "Hercules No, 2 stump puller, circa 1905. Nobody was looking at it. The crowd was at the tractor pull on the other side of the fairgrounds. But I stood there for a while because I was thinking about what that machine had done. Not this specific machine, but all of them. Every Hercules and every Hawkeye and every Monarch and every Quincy that ever sat in a cutover field with a cable running down to a stump and a horse walking in circles at the end of a sweep arm. I was thinking about the sound those roots made when they broke. I was thinking about the families that pooled their money to buy a machine they could share. I was thinking about the women who walked the horse alone in the rain. 60 million acres. That is the number, 60 million acres of American farmland that exists today because someone decided the Stumps had to come out and figured out a way to do it. Not with bulldozers, because bulldozers did not exist yet. Not with explosives, because dynamite was too expensive and too dangerous. But with iron and cable and the oldest source of power on the farm. A horse walking in a circle while the earth cracked open and gave up what it had been holding onto for decades. The math of the capstan made it possible. 25-to-1 mechanical advantage. A horse generating 1,500 pounds of pull at the sweep arm translated into 50,000 pounds at the stump. Simple physics. Beautiful physics. The kind of physics that a blacksmith in Iowa could understand and an immigrant farmer in Wisconsin could afford. The stump puller was not glamorous. It was not fast. It was not safe. Men died using these machines, killed by cables that snapped under tension, by sweep arms that caught them across the chest, by root balls that lurched sideways and pinned them to the ground. Horses died too, worked to exhaustion, startled into bolting, struck by flying debris when a massive root system tore free. The work was loud, dirty, slow, and relentless. Every stump took 15 minutes or an hour. Every acre might have 30 or 40 stumps. Every farm had dozens of acres to clear. The timeline was measured in seasons, not days. But they did it. 100 million times, they hooked a chain to a stump, walked a horse in a circle, and waited for the earth to let go. 100 million stumps ripped out of the ground by machines that weighed less than a modern riding mower. 100 million holes left behind in the dirt, each one a grave marker for a tree that had stood for 200 years before the loggers came. And then the machines themselves were abandoned, left to rust in the fields they had cleared. The iron returning to the earth it had spent 35 years fighting. Most of them are gone now. Melted down for scrap during the World War II steel drives, or simply dissolved by a century of rain and frost and oxidation. A few survive in museums, but even there, most visitors walk past them without stopping. They do not look like much. An iron tripod. A rusted drum. The ghost of a cable. You would have no idea what it did unless someone told you. So I'm telling you. Every time you drive through rural Wisconsin and see a flat green hayfield stretching to the tree line, that land was once a stump prairie. Every time you pass a dairy farm in Michigan's Upper Peninsula with cows grazing on smooth, rolling pasture, those pastures were once choked with the remains of white pines that had stood since before the American Revolution. Every one of those fields was cleared by hand, by horse, and by iron machines that turned simple physics into an act of will that reshaped the continent. The farmers who did this work are gone. Their children are mostly gone. The machines they used are rusting into dust in the corners of fields and the back rooms of county museums. The whole story is disappearing into the ground, the same ground those machines spent a generation tearing open. But the land remains. 60 million acres of it. Still producing. Still feeding people. Still carrying the invisible signature of the men and women and horses who cleared it, stump by stump, root by root, one slow rotation at a time. If you have family from the upper Midwest, ask them about the Stumps. Ask your grandparents, your great-aunts, your elderly neighbors. Someone in your family's past almost certainly stood in a cutover field and looked at 300 stumps and decided to clear them anyway. Someone in your line hooked a chain to a root ball and walked a horse in a circle and listened to the earth crack open beneath their feet. That story is part of who you are, even if nobody ever told it to you. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe. We find the forgotten machines and the forgotten people who use them, and we make sure someone remembers. The Hawkeye is gone, the Hercules is gone, the horse and the sweep arm and the cable are gone, but the land they cleared is still here, and that is the only monument these machines will ever get.